computer. Good. Okie dokie. Hey, so this is, you can see my screen now? Yeah? Do you see my screen? Am my screen sharing now?
You
No,
were
I see you.
before, and now you're not.
No, I'm not. Okay, so now I'm going to again. And now we are, I believe. Good. So as I was telling Levi, this is my first really public lecture on Rabbi Soloveitchik, which tells you I must have done a very bad job in marketing my book. And I have a little bit more perspective on the Rav than I had, I think, when I wrote the book, and a little bit more perspective on myself. I think, the title is, there's no such thing as modern orthodoxy. And that was kind of the clickbait, which you see has worked fantastically. But it's really not the main thing about what I want to say, although I think there is something to be said about the very idiosyncratic nature of Rabbi Soloveitchik's, or really, when we talk about the conception of Torah Umada, we're not really talking about his conception of Torah Umada, it's how his students understood it and how they passed it on and institutionalized it, I think. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, right? And I think, like, everything that drives the Rav in halachic man and halachic mind is this rebellion against subjectivity, really. Meaning, he's a kind of figure like T.S. Eliot a little bit in the English literary tradition, that after the indulgences of the 19th century, and for the Rabbi's Chassidus, and not romantic poetry as it is for Eliot, it's Chassidut, and it's also the Reform movement, that the subject is the unmoored subject is dangerous, and halachic man and halachic mind from different perspectives talk about that all of the time. Now, there's an extreme anxiety in both of these texts about the nature of knowledge and about the ways in which the hierarchies of knowledge that exist at the time are threatening to exclude halacha from any meaningful conversation. So what the Rav does is he makes a distinction between, on the one hand, the subjective humanities, and on the other, the sciences. And what he does is he puts them in dialogue, or says that they can be in dialogue if in fact there is something out there to which the subject can relate. So of course, for the Rav, the move is, right, the bad humanists, and I think they're like 19th century German philosophers mostly. So the bad humanists who emphasize too much the subject, well, we can't be them, but I mean, we are going to show the ways in which, and I think all the Rav's work does this in interesting ways, we are going to show the ways in which subjectivity and objectivity are implicated. But there needs to be an objective base, just like the sciences, forgive the use of the terms, we'll make them problematic in a second, that the objective world, such as it is, can only be accessed through the perspective of the subject. What is the objective world? Not nature, but enter halacha. So halacha then has this special kind of status. Now, as Talmidim of the Rav, some of them who are honest tell me that they're really, I don't know, the Rav does not write Torah Umada. He's not really talking, he doesn't theorize the relationship between Western culture and halacha. He really, in a way, he uses the kelim that he has available, which is 19th and 20th century philosophy and also philosophy of science, to try to give voice to the voice of the halachic man. And I think, one reason why this work is so important is because it doesn't only represent the worldview of the modern Orthodox world, of course it does, but it really is an articulation of the kind of assumptions that underlie the whole Brisker way of learning, and the Brisker way of learning is pretty much universal, right? I mean, except in its universal meaning also in Haredi yeshivas. So the Brisker derech is itself given a kind of definition in his work, in halachic man and in halachic mind. It's kind of, I mean, who is halachic man really about? What do we have? You have a, do you want, you like to, we talked about this, didn't we? Who do you say it's really about?
Halachic man, it's about his uncle and father and grandfather.
Okay, right. I would put it in that order also, right? Uncle, father, grandfather, right? Um, yeah. So right. I mean, this, and it's weird. The work is just a weird work because on the one hand, he's celebrating his ancestors. On the other hand, there is a kind of anxiety that he's trying to work out. Like, how do we, he justifies what he calls epistemological pluralism, by which he means not that, and this to me is very telling in the Rav's work, not that that functions internal to the tradition. And he almost never ever talks about Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim, but rather the way it's relevant external, that the tradition, the Jewish tradition itself has truth claims to make about the world, right? Scientists have truth claims to make about the world, and there is an epistemological pluralism. Other disciplines have that, and we also have that. We are able to make that claim. So I was going to ask, I was hoping to antagonize some of the Rav's Talmidim, and they would all be here defending Torah Mata anyway. What are the great works of Torah Mata? I mean, it's like it's more talked about than actually done. Who actually writes in that genre? And we'll see also that Torah Mata is very, very narrowly defined because of the way that the Rav does push off, not that he mentions them really in particular, but humanists and the humanities get kind of pushed off into bad subjectivity. So the whole phenomenon of Torah Mata as it gets expressed in Yeshiva University world and in its legacy is a very particular kind of relationship to the Western tradition. And it was also kind of cute 20 years ago, the way in which people would argue about Torah Mata, whether we should do it or shouldn't do it. And now the argument is so moot because there's everybody, except people in denial, acknowledges the extent to which we are implicated in so many different worlds at the same time. And I think there is also this idea in the modern Orthodox world that, Mada could be pursued without risk or with minimal risk, as Rav Lichtenstein says. It's almost like saying life can be pursued without risk. Life has risk in it. Reading has risk in it, right? Reading always has risk in it. If you're a good reader, that's the function of Elisha, the Acher. He's a good reader and he goes off the derech, right? Anyway, so let me just see if somebody was asking me for the link to this thing. No, just my kids. Sorry, where were we? Right. Right. Now, so the conception of Torah Mata, I don't see it as being an energizing principle anymore in modern Orthodoxy. It has been transformed, and other people living, I've talked about this as well, have talked about the way in which it's not really Torah Mata, it's really Torah and a way of excelling financially in Teaneck, right? That's the kind of, that's how it's manifested, which whatever. But so much of the Rav's work is based upon this distinction between subject and object. And he is very forceful in saying that it is a false dichotomy. This is just from halachic mind, right? Right, so the Rav is he's saying really form and matter, and he himself makes the parallel between form and matter and subject and object are part of a continuum, and neither form nor matter exist as an absolute ideal, right? It can't exist as an absolute ideal because it doesn't exist. You need one to define the other. So we'll just start with Aristotle. Nevertheless, he's just said, Aristotle spoke of matter, and his entire philosophy is indeed based upon the polarity of matter and form. And how can he do this if it's incomprehensible? The answer is that he applied the method of reconstruction that he gets from Natorp by a retrospective analysis, talking about, again, like him using the kelim that are available to him, right? This minor German Kantian philosopher who was major at the end of the 19th century. By a retrospective analysis of form, starting from the higher and traveling in the direction of the lower, he came upon the existence of matter. We know that in the Aristotelian hierarchy, pure matter is a fiction. Matter exists only after it has been actualized by the concept. This actualization again serves as a new potential out of which a higher degree of morphological realization may emerge. I'm kind of lost there. Matter and form, with the exception of pure matter, which is non-existent, and pure form, which is identical with God, are not two disparate realms, but represent different methodological arrows that determine the movement of noesis, of knowledge. Subject and matter, subject and form, form and matter are always interdefining. Look at the last sentence where he makes the parallel himself. Contemporary epistemology has no ontological hierarchy and considers the distinction between subjectivity and objectivity to be only directional. He's doing a lot of work with quantum physics here, and the ways in which, for the Rav, the theoreticians of quantum mechanics were showing the ways in which observation always played a role in what was seen. He's getting most of this from Niels Bohr. He's not saying really anything particularly radical about quantum mechanics. He is not being as some people would claim, about anybody who said such a thing, that they were crazy relativists. But obviously, the Rav is not saying that. What he's saying really is that there's always going to be some kind of relationship between subject and object, right? Now, what's strange about Rabbi Soloveitchik is that his own career really vacillates between an emphasis on the objective and an emphasis on the subjective. And, right, his early career, everything is, the halacha determines. Jesse, you know the Rav work, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay, I just want to know how basic I have to be, right? So as you know, the halacha is the form, a matrix through which one sees quote unquote reality. And the Rav is extremely sophisticated, especially for the time that he was living, in terms of understanding the way in which the constructs that we bring to the world create the world. In some sense, he is parallel in his thought to Kuhn, right? Or he's a Kuhnian thinker, Thomas Kuhn, who talks about the ways in which paradigms shape the reality that we see. And for the Rav, it's clearly this halachic reality that takes precedence over the real world. I learned in a halacha kollel, and the Rosh Kollel told us the story about I guess Soloveitchik or somebody in the family saying to his grandfather that his tea was burning, and Rav Chaim said, it couldn't possibly be burning, it was a kli shlishi, right? So that's a great example of the way in which, right, the halachic reality creates the reality. He who interrupts his study to say how beautiful that tree, that person is, as if he is chayiv kares, right? This importance, like the Rav is in a way saying, don't look at the real world. Look at the halachic world is the real world. And in halachic man, he talks about the ways in which he talks about knowledge. Now, we just read that passage about subject and object being integrated in this process of noesis, knowledge. And here in halachic man, I'm sure this is familiar to people. Here's the story of Rav Chaim. We'll start in the middle, page 73, right in the middle here. My father related to me when the fear of death would seize hold of Rav Chaim, he would throw himself with his entire heart and mind into the study of the laws of tents and corpse defilement. All these laws which revolve about such difficult and complex problems, blah, 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 would, etc., would calm the turbulence of his soul and would imbue it with a spirit of joy and gladness. When halachic man fears death, his sole weapon wherewith to fight this terrible dread is the eternal law of the halacha. The act of objectification triumphs over the subjective terror of death. The act of objectification triumphs. The mysterious relationship is an effect between the cognizing subject and the object that is comprehended, even though it is not logical and not psychological, results in any event in man deeming himself Lord and Master with respect to the thing that is about to be comprehended. The subject rules over the object, the person over the thing. I mean, Levi, I know you're writing about, the Rav's anti-enlightenment work, but in a certain ways, he's expressing it here, right? This is really the triumph of enlightenment. The subject rules over the object, the person over the thing. Knowledge, by definition, is the subjugation of the object and domination of the subject. You also know this. You also know the story of the Brisker Rav, or the hesped that the Rav gave for the Brisker Rav, and he talks in the same terms, even a little bit more powerfully about the power of the halachic man. He genders it also, the masculine penetrating into the reality of the world through his with his halachic weapons in hand. You can see this again. I'm sure you know this piece here. Confrontation, right? Confronted man is called upon to choose either of two alternatives: to play an active role as a subject, know or utilizing his great endowment, the intellect, in trying to gain supremacy over the objective order. However, this is fraught with difficulty because knowledge is gained only through the conflict, and the intellectual performance is an act of conquest. I mean, again, right? Like the period of time is the halachic man as master. Now, if you were going to give a 1 minute summation, Levi, of the Rav's work in the 50s, how would you describe it? And maybe even, I mean, obviously, it's a move to the subjective order, right? Out of the whirlwind. For me, that's the main work where you see that. Do you see? I obviously see a kind of progress here from. I'm not a progress, but go ahead. I'm interested to hear what your perspective is. Yeah.
I think the 50s is somewhat more of a mix. By the time you get to the 60s, you're looking at like Only Man of Faith and Catharsis, things like that. Like he's much more come down on the side of the importance of the subjective.
It's kind of like it's kind of like the Dead by 1973, really. I don't know if you're deadheads here. No deadheads.
No.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
He maintains that like intellectual knowing is a form of conquest and domination, that whole model, but he's less convinced that it is a sufficient model for the entirety of religious life.
Right, because suddenly, the subject-objective thing is very, very interesting for the Rav, but he's primarily interested in using this dichotomy when he's talking about the relationship to a commandment, like at the end of halachic mind, and he contrasts the Ramban and the Rambam, right? And the Ramban is, how do I internalize it, right? The Rav says the experience of the halacha is democratic and exoteric, right? Because everybody, when they pick up a lulav and an esrog, will have a different experience. They bring their subjectivity to that. But he talks about that dichotomy, the relationship between the two of them in relationship to the halachic act. But in the question of knowledge, what happens in the 50s, Levi, as you're saying, right, and certainly by the 60s, is the sense of the insufficiency of the halachic structures, the insufficiency of the objective structures, right? And he mentions Rudolf Otto and the idea of like there's the transcendent and the sublime and there's something left over. And he becomes like an existentialist. One of the peculiar things about Torah Umada, again, is like everybody is reading the same things that Rabbi Soloveitchik was reading, right? You'll find lots of articles about Kant and Kierkegaard, but you won't find so many about Shakespeare or whatever, or or Bertrand Russell, whatever, Wittgenstein, philosophers that the Rav wasn't reading. It's become such a straitjacket in a way. Levi, you know that the Rav himself talks about the importance of style, and style for him, I think, is individuality. Right? Everybody comes into the world and does things differently. So in a way, I think this really important talk for like YU people. Wasn't there just a piece you told me to read this piece in Tablet about why the Rav is the way forward? I didn't read it. But I think whatever that guy says, I don't think the Rav is the way forward. I think because what happens in the 50s and 60s is like, right, that objective order, that's not going to work anymore. And then we see in retrospect, we can read the anxieties back into halachic man, right? Because we see what happens in the 50s and 60s. But the Rav is dealing with this either or thing, which is very particular to the way he's constituting knowledge here. Like, if I were sitting in yeshiva, I would say, Mehechi Tesi. Where are we getting? Somebody, you want to say something? I definitely didn't recommend it. Okay.
It was just it was
It's a strange
such
piece.
a strange piece.
Okay, we'll talk about it, right? Mehechi Tesi. Where does he get this idea of knowledge is conquest? Where does that come from? Right? And the Rav also says, the future for Jewish philosophy is the halacha. I guess, but this is where this becomes personal. Is like after I finished my book on the Rav, I kind of put it aside, and I was learning lots of things, but I started learning Medrash a little bit, and then I realized if I'm going to learn Medrash, I have to learn Tehillim because that's the main source in Medrash, right? And it's also good just to see in general how Chazal are using psukim. I mean, Medrash is just like a total world of its own, and the poetry has a logic to it which is extraordinary. Right. So I learned Shir Shirim Rabbah, and Shir Shirim Rabbah, the first parak, talks about the genealogy of poetry. Where does poetry come from? The reason I'm turning to this now is, the Rav talks about how do we know things? And we know things through conquest. But then what happens is we have out of the whirlwind, there's the vision of Isaiah of fullness. And then there's the revelation of Yechezkel, right? And that itself, that feeling of obliteration, right? That itself is a kind of revelation. Shir Shirim Rabbah has a very different conception of what knowledge is. And I think it's just important to look at this because, and another cute name for this talk could be not halachic man, but midrashic man. Medrash is the place in which all of Jewish theology, all of Jewish liturgy, everything you need to know about Judaism, hashkafa, is in Medrash, right? Now, we have turned away from Medrash primarily because of the Soloveitchik family, because of Brisk. Because what happened in the 19th century was there was a tremendous anxiety about the sciences, right? My son-in-law is a Talmud of Rav Chaim Zimmerman, who is a descendant of Brisker family, that certainly in learning, and everything is logic. Everything is logic. So it's not only, so we have to find strategies to not learn Medrash. So one strategy is it's beyond us, right? That's actually used by the people who do explain it. It's beyond us, but let me tell you, as the guy downstairs in my shul would say, let me tell you something matim. And matim means it's not going to make sense, but you're going to say, wow, right? So the Briskers tell us not to learn it because we can't learn it. Then I would even call this guy, who's a Haredi guy in Beit Vagan, a neo-chassid, the Rav Moshe Shapiro people, but not Rav Moshe Shapiro himself so much, but whatever. They learn Medrash like Rav Pinchas, who was a big fad 10 or 15 years ago. Everything is kind of like we're taking it to the mystical abstraction. One of the diagnoses of the sickness of the Jewish world right now is we have these two oppositions. The people who spend in my neighborhood in Beit Vagan who learn halacha, right? Halacha, right? That's all you learn, halacha. And then this kind of mystical realm, right? Which is, and the Rav would obviously be critical of both of these things as well. But it's actually, Medrash itself demands a kind of learning and a way of knowing which is entirely antithetical to what the Rav describes as pure conquest. The first parak of Shir Shirim Rabbah is a defense of poetry. It is. And Chazal, in doing this, are really justifying their own poetic practice. They're turning to Shlomo Melech and they're saying, oh, so he wrote Proverbs, right? And he brought in Mashalim. Well, what's a mashal? What does it do, right? And obviously that needs definition. But they are, through creating a kind of history, and the history they say is like this, that up until the time of Shlomo Melech, people just lived in fear of God, right? They kept the Torah, they kept the law, they prayed. I don't even know if they prayed, but whatever. The fear, Yer Shamayim was enough. But at a certain point, Shlomo Melech understood that people needed more. So what does he do? And this is the genealogy of what Chazal say of poetry. Is Shlomo Melech invents the mashal, right? And why do we need the mashal? And here, I hope you can see this, Shir Shim Rabba. I think it's the best picture I have at the moment. So we'll read three parts of this sugya here. And we'll read them just because I have it here in English, and we'll stick on something in Hebrew if we get stuck, right? So Rav Nachman, he said two parallels. The first parable, the first mashal, is compared. Can you see this? It's even small for me, and I'm on a huge screen. Let me see if I can make this bigger. Right. Okay. Rav Nachman in his and it's also a bad picture. So there's a large palace, and people are. I'm not really sure what pshat is here. I don't know, they couldn't get in or they couldn't get out. I was learning pshat as they couldn't get out. So then a certain wise person, who will be compared to Shlomo Melech, came and took a coil of rope, which he hung at the way leading to and from the main entrance. Subsequently, when everyone would enter and exit the palace via the coil of rope. And then it goes on, pretty amazing, right? Up until the time of Shlomo Melech, people were not able to understand Divrei Torah. Now we'll see the second one, and then we'll go back and learn them both together, because Rav Nachman is dealing with certain issues that are coming about through turning Torah into something that's exoteric in the Rav's term, right? That other people, and the problem here is, and this is why I was learning the exit part, is that and we know the story about going to the parties. People going to the parties, they come out crazy. So here, it's not so much a fear of death or craziness, but everybody's going to go in their different directions. When you have a contact with the transcendent, you're going to leave and go off on your own derech. That's what 17th century scholars call antinomianism, right? Believe that everybody sees things their own way. So that Rav Nachman is dealing with it here, right? If people can go in, but then what? So Shlomo Melech, he created the safeguard, the second one. So now we're talking about l'chorshe shel konim, v'lo adam yachol lekanes ba, and a person couldn't enter into it. So he comes in with a scythe, and he cuts a path. Okay, so this is so how do you learn this one? I mean, this one seems to be just about, right? It's totally inaccessible. I would have thought the second one should come first. It's totally accessible, and Shlomo Melech finds a way of making it more accessible. There's a pshat that the art school brings about how the first one is about a person's assumptions or presuppositions, and the second one is something else. But it seems to me there's a pshat that learns it as individual to the knower himself or herself. But it seems to me that we're clearly talking about the issue of a multitude here, and what it is, and that's the anxiety here, especially in the first one, is how do you get a multitude inside without it tearing your religion apart? Anyway, so those two. The third one is really what I want to focus on. Okay. Amar Rabbi Chanina, leve'er hamuka, male mayim, v'hayu meimad sonani. I love this. Umatokim, betovim, right? It's like we're getting a little poetic here. And the rabbis, and this is the bad news for briskers, the rabbis are poets. They are poets. And, I thought there was an accident of my life that, wow, I really like 17th century poetry, and I really like, and I love learning. But there were few times in Western history where sacred poetry gets written, 17th century in England and throughout Midrash. And it's a sacred poetry has a very specific kind of challenge. And this is what the first parak of Shir Hashim Rabbah is doing. Is like, okay, right, this is a special form of knowledge because we're getting to the transcendent here, right? We're getting something that's not normally accessible. This is a special kind of noesis, right? So Rabbi Chanina said, this can be compared to a deep well full of water, whose waters were cool, sweet, and good, but no one was able to access its waters and drink from it. Then, ba'adam achad, u'v'sipek lachevel, b'chevel, meshicha b'meshicha, so hevel b'chevel, meshicha b'meshicha, v'dali mimenu v'shasa. Hizchilu akol dolim v'shosim. And we'll continue to see the rest of it. right? Kach also the shel Torah. Did I skip something here? The Hebrews in the bottom here. Oh, Kach amar ledavar mimashal lemashal. Sorry, one Kach midavar ledavar mimashal lemashal. Amid Shlomo al soda shel Torah. So similarly, by drawing comparison from one thing to another, and from one analogy to another, Shlomo grasped the secrets of the Torah. I wish we had that. I wish we had the Hebrew text. I mean, we do kind of. It's interesting. Well, there's a lot interesting here. And the word sipik, how do we translate that? Chevel b'chevel. Notice also, chevel b'chevel, meshicha l'meshicha, also an important word here. Meshicha b'meshicha, here it means string, right? And that's mashal l'mashal. So davar l'mashal l'mashal. So how do I get to the bottom of this pit? I tie things together. And I tie them together, different things together, right? They're distinctive. The Eitz Yosef brings, Sipek means lengthen, but he also brings up pshat that talks, oh no, Sipek means cut into pieces. He also brings a pshat which talks about laharich, right? Now, why is this important? Sipek, as cutting into pieces and joining together, one is joined together, one is lengthened. Hear the difference between the two of them? One is joined together. Disparate things are joined together. One is they're lengthened, they become one thing, right? At the center of this kind of defense of poetry is itself a kind of poem. That is, in order for you to, so I mean, this is a problem that sacred poets deal with. That is, I'm immortal. How do I actually know something? How do I know the secrets of Torah, right? Sodot shel Torah. So, lahavdil, Milton in Paradise Lost is constantly talking about the problem of teaching and revealing things that are invisible to mortal sight. And one of the great things about Milton and what makes him a great humanist, in a way in the same way that the rabbis were, is that they took the chance. They realized there's and in a way Milton does borrow from Chazal in their Midrash method. That's for another talk. But that itself is a problem. So Solomon is being understood in Shir Shirim Rabbah by the rabbis as the guy who can give access. And he gives access through different things, through mashal l'mashal, davar l'davar. It's not only, right? It's not only that I learn one thing and then I know something else. It's I learn one thing, and I think this is the process of limud Torah that I'm familiar with. Is we say Elu ve'elu direi Elokim Chaim, and that's an acknowledgement that the different pieces of knowledge that we get are going to be part of something greater. And there's that humility, right? The humility that we have doesn't mean we have to go and read Kierkegaard. The humility is built into the structure of the Midrash. The humility is I'm giving you a billion different perspectives to see them. Not one of them is exhaustive. That's why, conversations about whether Midrashim are ever thought to be literal is just so confusing to me, because it's the Midrash creates a reality made up of many, many things. It's almost like the Midrash, and almost in a Maimonidean way, the Midrash gives you a kind of hypothesis about what this thing might be, but then pulls back. There's 16 or there are 10 different metaphors for what Torah is here and how you grab hold of it. So this form of knowledge, this is a form of, and going back to the Rav, right? It's not like I have everything or know nothing. There's a Harvard philosopher, died recently, Hillary Putnam, 10 years ago. And he says, enough may not be everything, but enough is enough. That is, and that is basically, I think, the ethos of the rabbis in halacha, in Gemara, and certainly in Midrash. And the Briskers wanted everything. And because they wanted everything, when they found out they didn't have it, they had nothing. And the world of poetry is one where you never think you have everything. The Rambam brings the story in the Medrash, which is coming up here, I think, about how you can with just a pruta worth of wick, you can find gold, right? Or you can find a pearl. And it's hard to. I mean, the Rambam kind of says he kind of wants the metaphor to be erased. The way it's presented in the Medrash and the Talmud is that the vehicle of the metaphor is still there. It doesn't get burnt up. The Rambam talks about the Medrash itself gets burnt up, but that's not what wicks do. They illumine. I mean, eventually they burn up, but poetry, and this is why it's so important to reinstate poetry and reading poetically as part of the Jewish world, because poetry ideally never claims to have everything. When a poet claims to have everything, he becomes a bad poet, right? It's like Avodah Zarah, really. The poet, Milton's poem, Paradise Lost, it's called the Theodicy. He's justifying the ways of God to man. By the end of the poem, he fails, because if he had succeeded, he would be advocating the kind of bad reading that allows people to think that you can have everything in this world. And Milton always acknowledges, as we do, he gets it from us, that we're always in process. Part of the problem with Israeli politics today is that people think we're living in messianic times. And if you think you're living in messianic times, you can have everything. But trying to have everything in non-messianic times is very dangerous. So that all or nothing attitude pervades the Brisker world. It pervades the Jewish world. And poetry Medrash has been, just like it has been in the story of 17th and 18th century Enlightenment, pushed away. But really, it's not Rav Soloveitchik who's going to carry us into the future. It's people who are going to be able to immerse themselves in the poetry of the tradition. And when you pay, and like, right? Like, you could walk into the yeshiva down the block from me and you would tell them, your whole tradition is poetic. And they'd say, what? Right? And I don't only mean Tanakh. I also mean Gemara. There are poetic structures. David Weiss Halivni, right? Think what you want about him, but he made us think about ways in which the Talmud itself is constructed as a literary text. It is a literary text, to be treated as a literary text. And by literary text, I just mean we should have the same respect for this work as we have for Daf Gemara, but I'll even go say further, the same respect we have for Shakespeare, all right? Because when you pick up Shakespeare, you say, oh, he's saying something, right? People, when they pick up the Medrash, they don't say that. They don't think that. But Medrash itself is a skill. It's a way of learning. And the way you'd learn it is by reading it, right? By reading it, by learning with the Joseph, stay away from Kabbalistic stuff, because there's a lot of Kabbalistic perushim of the Medrash. But it's like, for me, I'm not ready for that, right? Maybe one day. But so, so that kind of goes back to the way in which Torah U'Mad, and we'll finish now, that it goes back to the way in which Torah U'Mad is understood. Like, did you go to the Gush, Jesse? You went to the Gush?
I did not, but I'm familiar with
right, Levi did, right?
With their drachim.
Right, so like, the English literary tradition is not, I'm sorry, Milton writing only about his father's blindness, which is moving, and 19th century humanists like Matthew Arnold and Cardinal Newman, right? Like, it's a cherry picking of the Western tradition. And in a way, it doesn't even get to what's really great about the Western tradition and what we can learn from it as Jews, as humans, which is a way of reading. right? Not just like, I always, Rav Lichtenstein doesn't talk about the Christological, the Christocentric part of Paradise Lost, right? You know, right. But it's like T.S. Eliot says of Dante, you can actually, this is, I think, a message for all humanists, you can actually read something you don't agree with and learn something from it, right? And one of the things you learn from reading the greats of the Western classics, as it were, is you learn how to read. I think in many ways they learned how to read from the rabbis in a way. It's a long, long road, but it goes through David, the Psalms, Augustine, Paul, whatever. And they're all reading David, and they're in a culture where they see what the rabbis are doing. In a way, the New Testament is a kind of midrash, right? An inferior one in my view, and full of very strange metaphysical assumptions, but nonetheless that. So, right, that can't be the, I really wanted some Torah Mata people here because it's totally ill-defined in my view. I don't even know what they're talking about. Why don't we read Shakespeare? We don't reach it, right? Because the Rav didn't read Shakespeare, right? Because the Rav Lichtenstein didn't read Shakespeare. We didn't talk about Shakespeare as much. So, this medrash here talks about, you want to get to the truth. It's a gradual process. And Chazal are saying this in this work. How do you do it? And it's interesting. It's on Shir Shirim Rabbah, right? The whole Kadosh Kadoshim, right? So they're saying you want to get to that level, you do it through poetry.